Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Happy New Year. Welcome to the January 2022 APA Justice meeting. My name is Jeremy Wu. I'll be moderating today's meeting with a lot of help from Professor Stephen Pei and Vincent Wang. My role as facilitator is to keep the meeting on schedule, facilitate Q&A, and transition from speaker to speaker and from topic to topic. We're scheduled to end the call at around 1 p.m. Eastern Time. To stay on time, I may be rude and apologize in advance if I must interrupt because the allotted time is running out. Now, in fact, for today, it's snowing quite heavily in the Washington, D.C. area right now. I have experienced sporadic power interruptions this morning, so Stephen and Vincent may have to step in as needed. We're recording today's meeting to help prepare a summary. Video portions of today's meeting may be posted publicly only with the speaker's permission. A written meeting summary will be posted at apajustice.org after the speakers have a chance to review it. Otherwise, the monthly meetings are off record. Please raise your questions using the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen. We will try to address them during and at the end of the meeting as time permits. We have several new speakers today, so let me give them a brief introduction at this time. First, we have Jamie Satterfield. Jamie is an award-winning journalist specializing in legal issues, crime, police, environmental crime, and investigative reporting. She has nearly 30 years of experience. Honors include a Scripps Howard Award for uncovering the poisoning of the workforce of the nation's largest coal ash spill, and she's inducted into the East Tennessee Writers Hall of Fame. Comments from the judges of the Scripps Howard Award include: reporter Jamie Satterfield delivers excellent watchdog work that truly holds the powerful accountable. Her investigation is deeply reported and swarms all the important angles. The series of stories were well sourced and contain videos with the on-the-record accounts that hit viewers between the eyes. Satterfield's extraordinary efforts result in change-inducing and life-saving journalism, end quote. Jamie's series of reports during the trial of Anming revealed tremendous insights into the federal government's abuse of power and the University of Tennessee's treatment to one of its own tenured faculty members. Through her reports and a recent webinar hosted by the Asian American Scholar Forum, she has also told Professor Hu's human story and his personal toll. We're honored and privileged that she will share a few thoughts with us today. Welcome, Jamie. Our next new speaker is Johanna Chao Kreilick. Johanna is the president of the Union of Concerned Scientists, a leading science-based advocacy organization that combines technical analysis and advocacy to create and implement innovative, practical solutions for a healthy, safe, and sustainable future. According to the UCS website, the Union of Concerned Scientists was founded in 1969 by scientists and students at MIT. The UCS founders drafted a statement calling for scientific research to be directed away from military technologies and towards solving present environmental and social problems. We remain true to that founding vision. Throughout our history, UCS has followed the example set by the scientific community. We share information, seek the truth, and let our findings guide our conclusions. End quote. Johanna has 3 decades of experience with social movements, science policy, and working to combat climate change before joining UCS. She has a presentation for us today to lead a discussion of the China Initiative. Welcome, Johanna. Johanna will be followed by Professor Edward Lazowska. He's also Bill and Melinda Gates Chair Emeritus, Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering at University of Washington. Ed will discuss what happened with a DARPA rubric that has been a matter of deep concern to both the Asian American and scientific communities. For background, DARPA is a research and development agency of the US Department of Defense. Its annual budget is about $3.5 billion, comprising approximately 220 government employees in 6 technical offices that include nearly 100 program managers, who together oversee about 250 research and development programs under the Department of Defense. DARPA first promulgated a problematic risk matrix on principal researchers in September. After Professor Lazowska and perhaps others met with DARPA officials in October, the risk matrix was revised and implemented at the beginning of December, along with a set of questions and answers. Ed will discuss what happened and the implications of its implementation. Welcome, Ed. We also have Gisela to come back and give us an update of the anti-racial profiling activities at Advancing Justice, AAJC. Now, started in the fall of 2015, the APA Justice Task Force has entered its 7th year of operation. The idea of APA Justice got started in May 2015, when CAPAC, led by Congresswoman Judy Chu, held a press conference on Capitol Hill after Sherry Chan's case was dismissed. And it was on the same day that Professor Xiaoxin Xi was arrested. His case was also dismissed the following September. Representative Chu is literally the reason of existence of APA Justice, as we responded to her call for a platform to connect and then build and sustain an ecosystem to address racial profiling and related justice and fairness issues. We are very much honored today by the presence of CAPAC Chair, Congresswoman Judy Chu today. And a quick introduction here that Judy was elected to the US House of Representatives in July 2009. In 2011, she was elected chair of CAPAC, which advocates for the needs and concerns of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community across the nation. Congresswoman Chu, would you please take the floor and help us kick off the new year of 2022 with your remarks? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And thank you for having me here today. As the chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, or what we call CAPAC, I am so honored to be here today to kick off this new year with you. It was back in 2015 when we were hearing reports of racial bias and profiling of Asian American, often Chinese scientists, researchers, and engineers, that I put out a call for the community to mobilize and organize around this issue. I am so proud to see the result of that call for community support in the APA Justice Task Force. There's never been a more important time for you to be in existence. When this community began to form in 2015, back when Sherry Chen and Dr. Xiaoxin Qi's cases became public, We never knew how large of a problem targeting our communities would become and what new struggles we would face. But thanks to your leadership, the Asian American scientific and academic community's voices are louder than ever before, and more people are aware of blatant profiling that is occurring within our own government. That is why one of my priorities as CAPAC chair has been to end the China initiative, which was started by President Trump at the height of his effort to turn America's attention away from Russia. This program, an effort to stop Chinese espionage in American scientific research, is unique among Department of Justice or DOJ investigations. Whereas most investigations start with a crime and then find a suspect, this initiative starts with a suspect based on ethnicity or national origin and then searches for a crime. Just family ties to China or even professionally encouraged research and collaboration can be enough to trigger an investigation. In fact, this initiative stands out as one of the only Department of Justice efforts named for a specific country. There is no Russia, Iran, or North Korea initiative, only a China initiative. And so as a result, simply doing research while Chinese could be enough to have your life and career ruined by a criminal conviction. Of course, this is known as racial profiling. This has real consequences for the way these investigations play out, with chilling effects for both the Chinese American community and our country as a whole. First, by looking specifically at Chinese scientists, we might be missing real instances of espionage from other countries. As former CIA Director Robert Gates said, there are probably a dozen or 15 countries that steal our technology. But only one country, China, has been deemed to require what FBI Director Christopher Wray called a whole of society response. This is the exact kind of language that leads to widespread mistrust of Chinese Americans. Second, this initiative prioritizes convictions, not justice, and that has too often meant bringing a case without sufficient grounds, something that has upended the lives of people like Dr. Anming, who was the first case to be brought under trial under the China initiative, and Dr. Franklin Chao, who was awaiting trial. Both, by the way, are cases that included clear FBI misconduct, and for Dr. Hu, resulted in his full acquittal. While I'm glad that Dr. Hu has been cleared, the damage has already been done. Already his career and reputation have been harmed, just as with other scientists and researchers like Xiao Shangqi and Sherry Chen, who suffered personal and professional harm only to have the charges dropped completely. But Dr. Hu's case echoes the situation of the 61 Chinese scientists accused who have been indicted mostly for paperwork errors and omissions of information and not actual economic espionage. It is chilling to have this, and it is affecting young Chinese Americans who are deciding to avoid careers in science out of fear they too will be investigated or worse. All of these reasons demonstrate why we in CAPAC have pushed for the China initiative to be brought to an end. There is a legitimate need for counter-espionage work in our government, but that work must be based on evidence and not race. And I'm optimistic that we can make this change because already, by speaking out, we have gotten the US government to end a shadowy unit at the Department of Commerce that had been investigating without any oversight anybody that they thought could be a security risk. Because of their free reign, their Investigations and Threat Management Service, or ITMS unit, had opened investigations on 2,000 employees, mostly Asian and Middle Eastern, based on their ethnicity and without their knowledge. When I heard about this unit, I immediately called for it to be disbanded. We in CAPAC then met with the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, to press her on it, and thankfully she has indeed eliminated this unit. but there is still more we must do. In addition to ending the China Initiative and other similar programs, we must stop the Cold War rhetoric. When the Chinese government acts against our interests or values, we can and must speak out. But we need to be deliberate in what and who we criticize. It should be those who are responsible, not all Chinese people. And we can't let fear become an excuse to rob Chinese Americans of their civil liberties. There are still those alive today who were forced into US prison camps during World War II because it was believed that just being Japanese American made them untrustworthy and spies. This policy was wrong then, and a policy of mass suspicion is wrong today. That is why last summer, I and our CAPAC leadership sent guidance to every member of Congress on how to speak out against China's policies without stoking xenophobia here. That means not spreading unfounded suspicions that paint all Chinese people as threats and which puts innocent Chinese Americans at risk. So what now? First of all, I'm so grateful for groups like the APA Justice Task Force for doing the important work of shedding light on these key issues affecting Asian Americans, especially Chinese scientists and researchers, because we would not have gotten as far as we have today. And let me say that representation matters. Certainly AAPI representation in Congress matters. We know what happens when we don't have it. As Asian Americans who have long suffered from the issue of invisibility and marginalization, where mainstream society assumes that they can take away the civil rights of the APIs without consequence. We were victims of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Japanese internment during World War II. That is why it is so important that we speak up and speak up now. We did that in fighting anti-Asian hate, and we were supported by so many. But it's been more difficult on the issue of the racial profiling of Chinese scientists and engineers. For some, it's because of a lack of awareness and a lack of media attention to this issue. For others, it is because of the issue of US-China tensions and the desire or pressure to get tough on China. And so we've redoubled our efforts to bring that attention and to distinguish the civil rights of Chinese Americans from the issue of US-China tensions. But the challenges occur all the time. Last year, we fought back against an amendment that a Republican Congress member wanted to put in the agriculture appropriations bill, barring all Chinese nationals from owning US agricultural land. Because of our protest, it was finally changed to barring only the Chinese companies wholly or partially owned by China. However, we could not get it changed to also include Russia, Iran, and North Korea. After all, how could it be more acceptable for Vladimir Putin to own US agricultural land than Xi Jinping? Nonetheless, we've had some important steps forward. Due to our urging, CAPAC member Representative Jamie Raskin hosted a House Government and Oversight Committee roundtable on this issue, in which we heard from incredible speakers like Dr. Xiao Shangxi and former Energy Secretary Stephen Chu. I know that APA Justice played a role in the success of that roundtable, and I want to thank you so much for that. Afterwards, Congress members said to me, I had no idea all this was happening to Chinese scientists and engineers. It was also an important step forward when during our CAPAC member meeting last October with US Attorney General Merrick Garland, we pressed him on ending the China Initiative. While he did not take a position on the initiative itself, he did say that he had just brought in an assistant Attorney General to do a full review of the China Initiative program and other national security cases. We know, of course, that Assistant Attorney General Matt Olsen is currently undertaking this review. And we in CAPAC will have a meeting with Matt Olsen on this issue. In response to our complaints about FBI stereotyping, Attorney General Garland also said that he reinstated the implicit bias training program with the Department of Justice, something that was dismantled during the Trump era. However, I felt that the most important step we took was for him to know that we are watching. We are watching to see if the Department of Justice oversteps, and if they do, we are ready to fight back. So thank you again for inviting me today to join your monthly call. I appreciate the leadership this group has taken when the need arose for our community to mobilize years ago. And while it's unfortunate that those needs have continued to grow, I am so heartened to know that a group like APA Justice Task Force is leading the way in bringing our community together to stand up for our civil rights. I appreciate that CAPAC is included in your monthly calls through Nisha's updates, and I'm thrilled to start this year by congratulating you all on the hard work that you have done on behalf of our community, and by encouraging you to stay strong on the road ahead as we work together this year. It is my hope that we will end the China Initiative. To speak out for those who are being racially profiled and targeted and just for being Chinese, and to continue building this diverse coalition of leaders across the country who are focusing on such an important issue. I look forward to working with you to ensure this continues to be a country inclusive of all people, where no one feels unsafe or un-American because of their faith or ethnicity, and an America where everybody is treated equally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative Chu, for your leadership and for taking precious time to share your thoughts with us this morning. I'd also like to mention that over the past 6 years, first it was Crystal, and now it's Nisha, who have tirelessly provided updates from CAPAC every month and staying in touch between meetings. So we very much appreciate their diligence and professionalism too. So we look forward to another great year and to tackle the issues that we need to tackle. Thank you very much. I understand that you have important work and your schedule is busy, and please stay as long as you can. At this time, I'd like to welcome Jamie Satterfield to take the floor for up to 10 minutes. Jamie's series of reports, as I mentioned earlier, really make the difference in terms of our whole community, the Asian American as well as the scientific community, in understanding the trial itself, the China Initiative itself. So at this point, Jamie, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I wasn't right there on video right away. Yes, to introduce myself, I'm an investigative journalist, and I have operated in that capacity for 33 years. And one of my specialties is the justice system. Dr. Who, his case was not mine when he was first arrested in 2020. And that's valuable knowledge, because I looked at Dr. Who's case like every other citizen. And the way it was presented is that he was a spy. And the University of Tennessee was shocked that they were employing someone who was a spy. So I've said this before, the University of Tennessee immediately threw Dr. Who under the bus without any real knowledge of the facts. They put out a press release, and then the U.S. Attorney's Office put out a press release. And what seemed strange to me as a journalist was that the release indicated he was a spy for China, but the charge was wire fraud. But again, it wasn't my case. And so the impression that was left of Dr. Who, one, he was a spy, and two, he's probably guilty, right? Because it's in the paper, it's on TV. And his side's not in there anywhere because he's in jail. So that's how his case started in terms of the public record and the public perception. And then, of course, as cases wound through the system, it took a while to get this case to trial. So there were no more updates. The public was no more aware of anything going on about a China initiative or any of that in terms of Dr. Who. I got a call right before his trial from the clerk of the judge that would be presiding over the trial. That was not unusual in that Judge Tom Barlin had respect for my work, and there would be cases where he thought that it was of public interest and would ask me to cover it. So the clerk called and said that this was one I really needed to cover. And as soon as I heard opening statements, I understood why I needed to cover it. And that was simply this. Dr. Who was targeted simply because he was born in China. And it was a Google search that was the basis for the FBI and the Department of Justice and the Department of Energy to launch a full-scale investigation of this man as a spy, because they Googled and found that he had written a paper or had done something, some connection to a Beijing university. And that was it. And not only did they not have any evidence on the front end, but they created the very evidence. They created the very crime that he was accused of committing. And this is how I will explain that. Under this China initiative, and in this particular case, there was a provision that NASA could not fund a grant if it somehow implicated China. It said nothing about Chinese universities. It was talking about the government. And it was a provision that was questionable when it was passed. Certainly wasn't intended to be used in a criminal way. It's not written that way. It's a regulation. But so what the FBI, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Justice did was they went into the University of Tennessee and they got the University of Tennessee to cooperate, to give them files on Dr. Who in clear violation of his rights. And they pieced together a case because Dr. Who is an incredible specialist and quite skilled at what he does. And I won't pretend, other than nanotechnology, that's about as deep as I can go as a non-scientist. But he's world renowned for what he does. And of course, NASA wanted his skill, his expertise, and his technology. And so he was applying for a grant for NASA. The NASA fellow he was working with was fully aware of these regulations that he had to meet. He had no concern about that. The University of Tennessee had no concern about that prior to the China initiative. So Dr. Who applied for a couple of grants and had no idea that he was being stalked, that his son, a student at the University of Tennessee, was being stalked by law enforcement. Dr. Who got stopped at an airport and his electronics confiscated. At one point, he had a conversation very early on with an FBI agent. And the FBI agent said to Dr. Who, "I have no evidence against you. I don't think you're a spy. But since you're from China, how about spying for us?" And when Dr. Who said no, and look, I want to say this, he didn't say no just because he didn't like the government. He said no because he's not doing anything illegal. So therefore, he's not the kind of guy that's going to be an informant for anyone. He's a scientist and an academic. So he told the FBI, thanks, but no thanks. And frankly, this is where it goes from China initiative, which is bad enough, to an agent being spurned. and he's promised a case under the China Initiative. He has engaged 2 other agencies. He now has to go after Dr. Who. And that's what they did. They set him up. The University of Tennessee assisted in setting this man up, allowed him to send in a grant application that they knew would lead to handcuffs for this man. And NASA, same deal. Same deal. This fella inks approval on something knowing that he's about to get Dr. Who arrested. That man has suffered no consequences. And the other thing I will say about this case is that at the time that the University of Tennessee agreed to cooperate with the Department of Justice in the China Initiative, the University of Tennessee was one of the most welcoming places for the Asian community. And there was I can't remember the exact name of it, but it was it had Chinese Institute perhaps in the name. But they would put on cultural events for the community. I took my kids, they were great. The University of Tennessee had no problem in terms of employing, being associated with the academic culture and the citizens of China. That's entirely different than doing business with the government of China, Russia, Korea. You start naming them. But the University of Tennessee had no qualms about these sorts of relationships, but immediately threw Dr. Who under the bus. And the University of Tennessee has never given an account or an explanation for why they treated this man as they did. So there was a lot of wrongdoing on the part of the University of Tennessee, on the part of the Department of Justice, the FBI, the Department of Energy, NASA. Where we did not have injustice was in the courtroom. And that's because, one, we had 2 jurors who were steadfast in their belief that this was a bogus case, and they refused to negotiate and certainly refused to convict. And they stood guard against those members of the jury who were ready to convict solely because Dr. Who was of Chinese descent, or solely because the federal government said he was guilty. So we had a hung jury, which resulted in a mistrial. Now, the Department of Justice at that point, with a 99% conviction rate, the expectation was that they would not retry or seek to retry Dr. Who. The same U.S. Attorney's Office just months before had lost in an appeal a very high profile case. That case was overturned. It involved a white man, a good old American businessman, convicted of defrauding his customers. And because of a technicality, he got a chance for a retrial. And that same U.S. Attorney's Office said, no, we're not going to retry him, too expensive. And yet, within 2 months of a hung jury, they say, we're going to retry him. And this is where the justice system kicked in. When you have independent judges. Judge Tom Barlin is a Republican appointee, not under the prior Republican administration. One could argue, simply because of that he would cater to or lean toward the Department of Justice. He's never been that way since he hit the bench. And in Dr. Who's case, what the judge did was allow the system to try to work, right? We're going to see if the jury can get it right. We're going to see if the Department of Justice will get it right in the end. And when those 2 things failed, Judge Varlin stepped in and dismissed this case, as should have happened. But in the meantime, Dr. Who's life was destroyed. I mean, I've recently lost my job. I know what that feels like. But he not only lost his job, but lost it with headlines. accusing him of being a spy, which impacts his wife and his children. It was a terrible, terrible case. I don't go around, I've covered thousands of trials and I've covered thousands of injustices, but this is one of the few that should not go unnoticed. And I am proud to say, in a largely white East Tennessee, that once I exposed what happened to Dr. Who, then I saw the community support change, and people began to question this China initiative and some of the stuff that they're being fed about the threat that China truly poses, and who represents that threat. It's certainly not academics like Dr. Who.
Thank you, Jamie. Based on your reports, as you have heard, Congresswoman Judy Chu mentioned that they have taken some actions, and I think you're making such a big difference. You shine the light on Professor Who's story. You're making a tremendous difference in the whole country, nationwide, not only in the Asian American community, but also scientific community, as well as touching many parts of the American society. So I thank you very much, and also come in and share your thoughts with us. And related to the China initiative, let me at this point welcome Johanna to take the floor. She has a presentation. And Stephen, would you at this time share her package? And then Johanna, would you start your talk at the same time?
Super. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And it really is an honor to join all of the speakers today and all of you on the call. In fact, it's very hope-giving for me. In my remarks today, I'm hoping to provide a compliment to Representative Chu's political leadership and Jamie Satterfield's incredible focus and leadership in the field of independent journalism, which plays such a role in fighting injustice and racial profiling. And I expect Professor Lazowska's important perspective as an engineer and scientist himself. And of course, all of you as legal advocates and litigators. The pillars of law, independent journalism, and science, I really think are absolutely essential, not just to science, but to democracy. And we're in a project, in a shared project of protecting both. I'm going to focus today on the role of science and science-based advocacy, and the role that my organization, the Union of Concerned Scientists, has been playing for over 50 years to protect the integrity of science, including strengthening the ability of all scientists to do their work free from political interference and racial profiling. So let me ask you, Stephen, to head to slide number 2. There we go. Perfect. Okay. All right. We're exactly where we need to be. So, strengthening the integrity of science as a pillar of democracy and justice and good governance has not only been an imperative for my organization, UCS, but has been a shaping force in my life as Chinese American. My late grandfather, Edward Chao, was a scientist who came to the United States from China in 1945. He attended the University of Chicago, earned his PhD in geology, and in 1949 was recruited by the United States Geological Survey, where he spent his entire 45-year career as a federal employee. At that time, and as a precursor to today's political climate, McCarthyism was, reaching its height, driven by racist, demagogic, restless, and unsubstantiated accusations of the late Senator Joe McCarthy. And in 1947, President Harry Truman had also just signed an executive order to screen federal employees for possible association with organizations deemed totalitarian, fascist, communist, or subversive. Next slide, please. It was against that backdrop that my grandfather designed NASA's first lunar sampling program. His work spanned the globe, from Arizona to Germany to Mongolia, and his geologic discoveries really provided the basis for whole segments of industry and economy. So you can see from this example the power of scientific exchange across mines and platforms, et cetera. Despite a lifetime of accomplishments and brilliance, he experienced pretty constant racism and hostility, all of which took a pretty severe toll on him, my family, and his ability to make, I think, his fullest scientific contribution to people and the planet. Next slide, please. So it's pretty appalling that more than 75 years later, not only does racism remain institutionalized, but it's actually been reinvigorated by the federal government in the form of the China Initiative and other policies. So as we've all been talking about, in November 2018, the Justice Department launched the China Initiative to prevent the theft of information and technology from US-based corporations and research labs. And while that ambition might be praiseworthy in theory, what is really happening is they're cracking down on scientists and really just perpetuating racial injustice and frankly stifling the kind of scientific collaboration and exchange that's going to be essential for making the kind of transformative change in technology and in our economies that's going to really be required to avoid climate catastrophe, nuclear, war, and the downfall of democracy, frankly. Next slide, please. So very recently, an MIT investigation of the China Initiative found a pattern of civil rights abuses tantamount to an assault on Chinese American scholars. We've talked a bit about that today. I won't go into detail here, but let me ask you to go to the next slide, please. Another recent analysis in November by Bloomberg News found much the same results. So for example, the very few cases that the Department of Justice described as espionage were actually cases of people personally profiteering, not doing something that benefited China. In fact, instead of catching spies, the bulk of the indictments were over failures to disclose affiliations with Chinese universities, usually when applying for federal research funding. And it's important to note that the FBI officials themselves have admitted that their disclosure rules were unclear. Next slide, please. Gang Chen, a researcher at MIT, as you I'm sure know, is being prosecuted on these grounds, despite the fact that MIT itself facilitated his collaboration with the university in China and handled the grant funding. MIT is covering his legal fees. Next slide, please. Lawyers for other academics charged in China Initiative cases have rightly argued that US universities have long encouraged their faculty to collaborate with other universities, including in China. We've heard colleagues talk today about some of that. Next slide, please. And one scientist who moved back to China identified genes for heart arrhythmia. The charges against him for failing to disclose his research in China were dropped after he produced a letter from the Cleveland Clinic showing that he had indeed had permission. Next slide, please. So the irony is that the China Initiative has generated exactly the kind of results that the United States was trying to avoid. Some of the best and the brightest scientists are now returning to China. And in so many cases, as we've heard, careers are being destroyed despite scientists doing nothing wrong. Next slide, please. But one of the biggest liabilities and threats of the China Initiative is how it is stifling the potential for scientific innovation. Scientific research, by its very nature, is intended for publication and sharing, which means being shared with the wider world, not being kept secret or owned or transferred to a country's government. The opportunity costs we are paying in the form of the China Initiative and other proposed legislation are essentially stifling scientific freedom, exchange, and collaboration, and this cannot be overestimated. Next slide, please. The Union of Concerned Scientists has a long history of fighting the politicization of science in the federal government, and President Biden has spoken himself out against it. My organization thinks protection from political interference should extend to wherever a scientist is working, especially when they are conducting research for the public good. Next slide, please. So while the Biden administration has also committed to addressing longstanding racial inequities and injustices, the China Initiative is an antithesis of both of these goals, goals that the Union of Concerned Scientists has put front and center in its work. The Biden administration presumably also knows that neither the Asian American community nor scientific organizations weighed in on the China Initiative before it was rolled out. It must rectify this oversight by listening to their constituents now about the program's ramifications. We saw this in the leadership of Congresswoman Judy Chu and all of you on this call. Next slide, please. Now, Congress, as you know, appears poised to expand on the scope of the China Initiative. Legislation passed by the Senate, the Innovation and Competition Act, would require federal agencies and departments to scrutinize US governmental and non-governmental activities connected to China. So again, not just governmental, but also non-governmental activities. In this, if this legislation were to be passed, the head of every federal agency would designate an undersecretary focused on ferreting out Chinese influence. US citizens, businesses, educational institutions, and civic groups could be investigated for routine activities, creating, as we heard Representative Chu saying, a chilling effect on normal economic, social, and cultural interactions between ordinary Chinese and Americans. This will only increase the troubling racial profiling we've seen, with Chinese Americans bearing the brunt of it. Next slide, please. So my organization is calling on Congress to remove all the problematic language in this bill. And if lawmakers want to increase US competitiveness, we say that they should also focus on the measures in the House version of the bill, which is called the Ensuring American Global Leadership and Engagement Act, or the EAGLE Act, that would provide investment in US science and technology. So I'd like to encourage all of you to share this message with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and I'm certain that Congresswoman Chu is at the helm of this, as she negotiates the final version of this bill with a group of representatives and senators. In fact, my team feels we have an opportunity to stop a lot more harm if we can convince Pelosi to hold firm on the House version of the new China bill. She has, as you can imagine, one of the largest Asian American constituencies in the country in her San Francisco district, and APA Justice can carry a big bat with her on this, I believe. So I'm glad to see your focus on this problem. The FBI China Initiative fight is important, of course, but it looks like we're getting some good traction there. This new China legislation is still flying under the radar and is far more dangerous. So just moving on to my last slide here and wrapping up. Truly, the White House and Congress must realize we are facing existential threats, scientific threats. The three that I see and that UCS works on are climate change, the erosion of democracy at home and around the world, and the risk of nuclear war, all which factor into the nexus of US-China relations. We can truly only overcome these threats by working together as an international community, which means civilians, scientists, government leaders, collaborating together. So thank you so much for your efforts and work, and we stand with you to move this forward. I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Jeremy.
Thank you so much, Johanna. There is a lot of work ahead of us, and I hope we will have plenty of opportunities to work together in the new year. And your talk is a perfect segue into Professor Lazowska's talk about a specific part that deals with the DARPA rubric. Ed, would you take the floor at this point, please?
Happy to, and I need screen sharing enabled, please.
Stephen, would you?
An honor to be with you today, and I have to say that in contrast to Johanna Kreilick's presentation, I have a narrow topic and boring slides, but we'll do the best we can. I've been asked to speak to you about DARPA's risk matrix, which was rolled out in September, and then in a positive note, under pressure, revised in December. So that's the optimistic aspect of this. And as as Representative Chu illustrated also, there are situations in which the government has moved in a more reasonable direction when individuals and groups have approached them. As again, Johanna Kreilick said, the goal here is perhaps a reasonable goal, and that is there is intellectual property theft related to critical technologies, and we in universities have undoubtedly not taken that sufficiently seriously. So the question is how these issues can be addressed without racial profiling, as Representative Chu said, based on evidence rather than race. And that was precisely the problem with DARPA's original matrix. So let me quickly show you the original matrix, which I won't belabor because it is now gone. It is has been deleted, but this is a matrix. You see on the left, very high, high, moderate, low risk, broad qualitative metrics, and then specific actions. And the critical issue from our point of view was that essentially anyone with any connections to China, and China was specifically targeted here, Russia and China, was deemed high risk simply based on those connections rather than based on any actions. This was brought to my attention in October by Fei Li, a top computer scientist at Stanford. And she forwarded to me an email that was an exchange the previous day between a young faculty member at her department, computer science, and Stanford's provost. And again, this was an exercise in ethnic profiling. It labeled people as risks based on factors that involved associations, not actions. Anyone with colleagues or family in China was deemed very high risk. So I immediately contacted OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy and PCAST leadership. That's Eric Lander and Maria Zuber and Francis Arnold that day, and they had not been aware of this DARPA initiative at all. I also contacted Peter Harsha, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the Computing Research Association, which represents academic and industry researchers in the field. And he launched some inquiries with DARPA. And DARPA's story, which Peter relayed to me a couple of days later, was this is the new normal. It's required by law. And there has been coordination with all research agencies. Fortuitously, a day after that, there was a meeting of COSMPUP, the National Academy's Committee on Public Policy, on which I serve. And I brought this up at that meeting, and Rebecca Kaiser, who's the National Science Foundation's newly appointed Chief of Research Security Strategy and Policy, was a guest at the meeting. And the next day she emailed me saying, I can confirm that this has not been coordinated with us. Okay. And that day, Ponch, the director of the National Science Foundation, sent a note to the National Science Board stating that there was a narrative circulating that NSF had been consulted on the development of the DARPA policy, but that's not true. And in fact, NSF had only just become aware of it and would not adopt an approach like that. So several DARPA misrepresentations were quickly contradicted. Rebecca arranged a meeting between DOD and DARPA leadership and a group of us from the Computing Research Association, which took place in late October. And there were 4 DOD and DARPA participants: the Director of Basic Research in the Office of Secretary of Defense, the Director of Contracts Management in DARPA, and a gentleman who's the Assistant Director for Policy and Oversight in the Security and Intelligence Directorate, and been a primary author of that matrix. And this was a very positive meeting. DARPA and DOD agreed that the risk matrix was ill-conceived and stated it didn't reflect their intent, and said they would consider some suggestions that we made. And we then followed up with an email in which we made a set of honestly very conservative suggestions to them. We phrased these so that we hoped they would be adopted. One was remove specific mentions of countries, so the policy doesn't seem to target 1 or 2 particular nationalities. Secondly, simply get rid of the broad qualitative metric category. Focus on specific actions of senior personnel. Focus on activities rather than associations. Note that activities that were legal and appropriate when they were undertaken shouldn't be triggers. And finally, replace or reword mentions of degrees of risk associated with people because of nationality or family. The wording implies that that people are risk simply because of family or ethnicity, which is not what they claimed their intention was. And time passed and there was no action, but a few weeks ago, a new version of the matrix appeared. Interesting, I put the URL at the bottom and you'll see that it overlays the original version of the matrix, which has now disappeared, except that I grabbed a copy of it long ago. So it's at the original September URL. But among other things, the column that focused on essentially nationality rather than actions has been deleted. There are a number of other changes. And then there's a pretty useful fact, frequently asked questions associated with it. That URL is here as well, and I'll share these slides. The fact has a number of pages, but I think reflects a more reasonable approach by DARPA. And it also corrects some previous misstatements. For example, it states that DARPA did not coordinate with other agencies. The one other thing I would add is that prior to this posting, I ran into Washington Senator Maria Cantwell on November 27th. She's chair of the Commerce Committee, and she said she hoped to address this in the research bill that was being worked on, and put me in touch with Richard Dwayne Chambers, the staffer who was coordinating. And he and I spoke on the last day of November. What he said was, look, it's politically very complex, and their strategy is to have OSTP promulgate reasonable standards that would apply to all agencies, rather than leaving it to individual agencies to come up with standards of their own. And I think that's would be a reasonable way to proceed under the circumstances. So I would say the optimistic part of this is that it's another instance like the one that Representative Chu cited of an agency changing its approach when questioned about it. At the same time, my Chinese colleagues are under assault in this nation, and we have to be aware of that. Fei Li, for example, is a global leader of artificial intelligence research and a leader of the current federal National AI Research Resource Task Force. And she has had multiple death threats and has been accused of being a Chinese spy, including by 2 members of Congress. These are not members of Congress that you and I associate with, but nonetheless, it's a serious, grave issue. Johanna Kreilick noted a number of scientists who've been under judicial assault. I think we all expected that with the change of administration, the Department of Justice would change its approach, and that has not happened. It's happening very slowly. I have a wonderful young colleague here at the University of Washington who has a green card. He has a PhD from MIT. And he had ICE show up at his door 4 times and has now left us to work at Amazon because he feels he needs to go underground, and he cannot conduct computer systems research underground at a university, whereas he could do that at Amazon. And he simply does not want his name on grant proposals or proposal reviews or research papers. This is devastating to the international community that we all are part of, and the government's behavior has simply got to change, and we need to continue the focus that UCS and APA Justice and Representative Chu and others have on this topic. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Ed, and thank you for your timely action. We also have Professor Xi here, and you may have heard of his story before. And he actually alerted us back in September about the original version of DARPA. And Professor Xi is here. Xiaoxing, would you like to raise your question or comment for Professor Lazowska?
Sure, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you, Professor Lazowska. And I really appreciate the insights and all the efforts that you and others are putting in. And frankly, based on the original DARPA risk rubric, and also based on the U.S. Innovation and Competitive Act of 2021 that Johanna mentioned, I have been telling people that this country is moving in the direction that there will be no academic exchange with China. There will be few, if any, graduate students from China. And anyone who collaborates with Chinese colleagues will be extremely punished, severely punished. And the professors like me who come from China will become an extinct species unless the scientific community put up a strong pushback and convince the American public that this is bad for the country and convince the policymaker that this hurt American science. And so my question to you is, do you think there is a strong pushback from the scientific community, which is aiming to stop this becoming a reality? I'm very encouraged by what you have done and many other leaders have done. And do you think this will be strong enough to change the trend of this country to go the direction that I think is going towards?
No, it needs to be far stronger. But obviously the University of Concerned Scientists is working, Union of Concerned Scientists is working hard on this. Members of my field have worked hard on this. Many people are working hard on it. It needs to be something that the research community as a whole embraces, not just Chinese members of the research community. My field, computer science, is a wonderful example of the importance, not only in research, but in technology, of the sort of interchange and of the presence of Chinese and Indian and other immigrants in this nation. As I'm sure you're aware, a staggering proportion of technology startups in this nation have been established and led by immigrants. We cripple the nation by operating under the illusion that we are the place and we are the nationality where innovation occurs. Increasingly, advances in science and engineering and medicine are global rather than local to one country. Increasingly, the United States is one contributor to global advancement in science and engineering and medicine. If we isolate ourselves or fail to take advantage of the best minds in the world, we will eventually and rapidly lose our position of technological leadership. So I think we need to do a lot more to raise the attention of the public and policymakers to this issue. Certainly, I would like to see organizations such as the AAU and various other organizations of leading universities take a serious stand on this. I can't claim to be politically savvy. One doesn't want to do this in ways that triggers a backlash by, there are plenty of racists left in this country, including in Congress, all right? And we need to be careful to proceed in a way that gathers allies and does not empower the opposition. But, racism is alive and well in this nation.
Thank you very much. And I absolutely agree with you and really appreciate your leadership and the leadership of many.
Well, in this particular instance, I was just in the right place at the right time, and Fei reached out to me because she and I were participating in a panel the following week and had to get organized, and she raised this issue, and it clearly needed attention. So I was privileged to be in the right place at the right time to help others push this along.
Well, thank you
Thank
both,
you.
Xiaoxing and Ed. Let me at this point quickly, I hope both of you can stay overtime and allot a few minutes for further discussion. But at this time, let me move on to Gisela. And would you give us an update from Advancing Justice AJC, please?
We just lost her.
Oh, we lost her. Sorry about that. If or when she returns, we'll get back to her. But if I may follow up, I think this has been a great discussion. And I think Gisela's topic is about an appeal that is being made by AJC and ACLU about Professor Xi's case that will be going to the Court of Appeals, and some notification and sign-on letter will be coming out after today's meeting. But returning to Ed and Johanna and Xiaoxing, especially Ed, let me start when you mentioned about Senator Cantwell. She's the chair of the Commerce Committee. And the ranking member of the Commerce Committee, Roger Wicker, was actually the one who conducted the investigation that led to the disbanding of the investigative unit in the Department of Commerce. So if anything, I think this should be a bipartisan effort. And I'm so glad that you mentioned Senator Cantwell. And I think Senator Wicker is also very big in terms of this Department of Commerce situation involving an investigative unit, which is a very small unit, but it became a rogue unit for 15 years. That could not have happened without some systemic support and involvement. So I guess many of the activities for APA Justice, it doesn't happen during the monthly meetings. It happens between the monthly meetings. And in that regard, I think there's a lot that we need to discuss, and I want to bring this up. And Ed, I think I had a question for you before, and that is, do you see the possibility of spilling the DARPA thinking, spilling into the non-military side, the civilian side? And you mentioned about Dr. Kaiser. Is she sympathetic, and would she be a good spokesperson on this topic? So that's just a quick question for you, and others please chime in.
Yeah, I think first of all, I want to be optimistic towards DARPA. They in our conversation, there were 5 or 6 of us from the Computing Research Association and the 4 individuals from DARPA. They were quite open to the notion that they had overreached and overreacted in the risk matrix. And in the space of a month or so, they revised the matrix in some very positive ways. So I think agencies are responding to a set of pressures that they feel. I think when we speak of the Commerce Committee, one concern, and I do not understand the politics of this at all, is that a goal of the Commerce Committee is to get the research legislation passed. It's important for a number of reasons. And I think that there is some concern that taking too strong a stance on the issues we're talking about would jeopardize the passage of the overall bill, because there are some members of Congress who feel strongly that that the sorts of crackdowns that we're discussing today are appropriate. Okay, so I think it's a complicated political dynamic. It's important that the director of the National Science Foundation, the day after the DARPA matrix was brought to his attention and he learned that DARPA had suggested that NSF had been consulted, stated that NSF had not been consulted and that NSF understood the bedrock importance of international collaboration, okay, and would not go that direction. So I think NSF has a stake in the ground in the right place. My understanding is that NIH some months ago was in fact responsible for a lot of the pressure that we're feeling, okay? And that's extremely disappointing. We were, at many universities, subject to a sort of intellectual property security theater that's analogous to what we experienced from TSA, all right, at the airport. For example, we had been getting, in my program, unrestricted gifts from Huawei to support computer systems and virtual reality research. And in return for this, again, it's an unrestricted gift of $1 million a year. 24 engineers from the Huawei facility in Bellevue, Washington would come over twice a year and have a half-day presentation from graduate students on papers they had published in the open literature in the past 6 months. So this had nothing to do with intellectual property theft, but we were told we had to stop taking those gifts, and the same happened at MIT. And the explanation I was given was, well, this is a company that does some bad things, and I'm willing to admit that that's the case, even if it's not my colleagues in Bellevue who do it. And they said, for reasons of reputation, we don't accept gifts from just anyone, okay, even unrestricted gifts. But we take gifts from the Sacklers and from Jeffrey Epstein and from the Saudis. For God's sakes, give me a break. This is just racism, and it is knuckling under to pressure, I understood in that case, principally from NIH, to institute some fairly draconian restrictions on international collaboration if universities did not appear to be taking the intellectual theft problem more seriously, but instead what we got was theater. Sorry for going on so long.
No, that's extremely valuable and informative. I do want to say that our next meeting will be February 7th. So we're running over time, but this is extremely valuable to me, and I'm sure that for many of the participants. So we'll try to take the extra time if those who can afford it can stay. But otherwise, our next meeting will be February 7th. The Chinese New Year, the Lunar New Year day will be on February 1st. So with that, I wish those of you who cannot stay a Happy New Year, and those of you who stay also a Happy New Year. It's the year of the tiger coming up. But with that, let me return to the discussions. Anyone else who would like to chime in at this point?
May I suggest that as Anisha is here, would you like to say a few words for the new year? Oh, he just dropped out.
She just had to drop out, yes.
Okay, sorry about that.
Xiaoxing, would you like to follow up with your question, and then perhaps Johanna and Jamie?
Yeah, I think the new frame is a big progress. However, when I look at it, I mean, it will still not be wise nowadays to, let's say, for example, be appointed a guest professor at Peking University, or maybe giving a talk and in China and get paid for a hotel room, or maybe that would still be high risk. But those are I know colleagues who are members of the Chinese Academy of Science, and that would definitely be high risk. And I myself was a guest professor at Peking University. I don't know whether I still am or not, but that would be high risk. Oh, well, high risk, yes. And so I don't know. I'm still not feeling that we are exempt from being considered high risk. And I think the US Innovation and Competitive Act of 2021, I mean, there are provisions that's very specific that people who participate in foreign government talent program should not get funding and should not utilize the funding from the federal government. And then, as Maria Zuber says, that the current definition of those talents program is too broad and basically could just prohibit any work with China. So I'm not very optimistic about this. And I agree with Professor Lazowska that we need much stronger pushback.
Johanna?
Yeah, I'll just close by saying thank you again, and with sort of two last parting thoughts. One on what's at stake. Clearly, we're talking about sort of the lives and livelihoods of scientists and Chinese American scientists and their exchange in this country, but beyond. But I also think what's truly at stake is the integrity of scientific exchange itself and scientific collaboration and cooperation. And honestly, I think what really then is at stake because of all of that is truly our future. Because without that type of collaboration and cooperation, I don't see how we're going to be able to, again, make the transformational structural changes that we need to. No one country, no one domain of science, no one technology is going to solve the situation we find ourselves in. So just to the very good point about what can we all do about it, I think the design of this panel actually is a great illustration. It's going to take every single one of the people on this call and beyond, from the champions of independent journalism like Jamie to the clear thinking sort of leadership scientists themselves like Professor Xi and Professor Lazowska, to all of you, again, legal advocates and litigators and scholars on the call, to the incredible political leadership of Representative Chu. And I'm actually really grateful because Nisha just reached out to me, and we're going to talk a bit more about the Innovation and Competition Act and what we might do. But I think we're going to need to think out of the box and join forces together to figure out how to sort of take this on and help lift each other up, because this work is hard. And it can be incredibly demoralizing if we do it alone and in isolation. So thank you for having me, and I'll stop there.
Jamie, I think that last year when I talked to Peter Warman of the Bloomberg, he was thinking about writing a book. Maybe you should do as well. I think you have a lot of stories to tell.
I have to say that the more I participate in these discussions, the more disturbed I am, especially about journalism. Media organizations adopt this notion of a singular threat from China, of all things China, and then citizens go around looking at people suspiciously, and they're so ready to believe what the government says. And Dr. Hu's case is such a great example, a terrible example, but an example nonetheless. So I think that the importance for your group particularly is to tell those stories. I find, just as I did with the story, when I took the race and ethnicity and kind of set that aside. It certainly was the reason that Dr. Who was in that position. But when I just presented him as a University of Tennessee professor whose life was destroyed by government, that got people to pay attention. So I think part of this will be messaging. And I think that certainly I am now very much aware of this issue. And as I think back, I've covered other cases in which students who were of Chinese descent were involved. And these are students who were not told and had no idea that they were putting themselves at risk. So the chilling factor that all of you all have addressed, I've seen. And Dr. Who's case was a worst case scenario of that, because if I am of Chinese descent, I won't go anywhere near the University of Tennessee, and the East Tennessee community relies on international scientists. We have the Oak Ridge Lab here, National Lab, the University of Tennessee itself. The contributions from scientists all over this country who are of Chinese descent is extraordinary, and that must continue. So thank you for allowing me to participate.
I think, Jeremy, I have to add, the last time when you spoke at the forum hosted by the Asian American Scholar Forum, afterwards, quite a few people provided feedback saying, we've been hearing this discussion from East and West Coast, but you and Phil together, you speak up from the Midwest, from the heartland. That was refreshing for us. So we really thank you for your coverage of Professor Who's case. I think that really you would have brought the attention of the whole nationwide attention to the topic. And I think, as Jeremy said earlier, I think your impact is much, much broader than you might have imagined. We really thank you from the bottom of our heart.
Well, thank you. I've been through a bit of a trying time, and I've always found that when you reach out to help other people, it makes you feel a whole lot better. And y'all have just brought me joy. And I will continue to speak whenever I'm called upon to do so. So thank you.
Well, Stephen, Joanne, go ahead. Stephen, would you like to have the last word for today's meeting?
Well, I think if there's no objection from all the speakers, I really think the video today should make public. I think we have some very important message here to go out. And today we don't have any emphatic scientists speaking. I do not see any reason why this video cannot be made public. So we'll follow up with each one of the speakers. If with your consent, we are going to release the video.
Fine with me.
And then also your presentation package. Right.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Happy New Year again.
Thank you.
With that, thank you, everyone. We adjourn today. And Happy New Year, the year of the
New Year to
tiger,
everyone.
the year of 2022. Bye-bye.
New Year.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Bye-bye.